Welcome to the Resource Podcast, where we take a slightly sassy, fully feminist approach to creating healthy relationships and a joyful life. I'm your host, Tatiana Thompson, and I'm a licensed professional counselor practicing in both Arizona and Minnesota. I specialize in applying clinically proven techniques like EMDR, parts work, and neural reprogramming to help you see real, lasting change in your everyday life. Just remember, I am a licensed therapist, but I'm not your therapist. This show is for informational purposes only, and it's not a replacement for seeking personal mental health or medical advice. So join me now as we explore simple strategies for breaking toxic relationship patterns and applying simple mental health tools to your daily life. Learn how to take the small steps today that will guide you to your best life tomorrow. Hello and welcome to the Resourced Podcast, the show that invites you to question everything you thought you knew about relationships and mental health so you can finally break through your stuck points and create the life you've always wanted. I'm your host, Tatiana, and I'm on a mission to help 1,000 women become emotionally and financially independent so they can choose a relationship instead of needing one. And today I want to talk about what we need to see from men to start healing this gender divide that's going on. Because if I hear this statement, not all men, one more time, I personally might lose my mind. So I want to open with a quote that I think really encapsulates the entire point of why this sentiment is so invalidating at best and harmful at worst. So here it is. A man's life will become better if he does not judge all women by the actions of the most cruel few. But a woman's life will be over if she does not judge all men by the actions of the most cruel few. Damn. Have truer words ever been spoken? Don't think so. So first off, I'd like to give credit to the person who said this. His name is Andrew Bailey. I don't know if it was his original quote, but he's on Instagram and you can find him at Streetlight Eyes Don't Die. Again, Andrew Bailey. His stated mission is that he wants to heal the gender divide. And he's actually in that quote, he's expounding on the famous one and oh so accurate quote by Margaret Atwood that men are afraid that women will laugh at them. Women are afraid that men will kill them. Both of these quotes help to illuminate why the not all men rhetoric is harmful and how it's just another tactic of the patriarchy to maintain the status quo. See, if whenever we have a complaint about how a man treats us, we're expected to make sure not to offend anyone or to invalidate our own pain or experiences, tend to the feelings of men or anyone else, we can't possibly gain the momentum or force needed to stand up and demand change if we always have to be walking on eggshells. But before I dig any further, I would like to offer some disclaimers and intentions for this episode. First disclaimer is I will be cussing in this episode, so please be prepared for that. If not, don't show it to someone who should not be listening to the F-bomb, okay? This is another 2-part episode. Today's episode is going to be about exposing the problem of covert misogyny. And then the next episode's about how women and hopefully men can start changing this narrative as well. And what I want to make crystal clear is that this episode and the next one, they're not intended to create a victim mindset or like make us just wallow in this misery of what, womanhood is. It's also not to condone mistreatment of men or any like over coddling of women. My mission here is to empower everyone, but especially to empower women, because in this particular structure, in this situation of sexism and misogyny, we are the disadvantaged class, and it is very hard for some people to hear us, the people who need to help us the most. So I want to help us move from abuse and mistreatment into empowerment. And here's why it's going to sound like a lot of complaining, because there are necessary steps that a person has to walk through to get to the point where they stand up for themselves. So the first step, as I've discussed in other episodes, is we actually have to have an empathic witness to the harm we've experienced. We have to have someone who validates it and holds space for our pain. So we must offer that to each other, which this episode is meant to do. But most importantly, we also must provide it to ourselves, because it gradually teaches us to expect it from the people in our lives, including the men in our lives who want closeness with us. We need to expect our men to validate this and to also be empathic witnesses. They can't simply show up and expect us to trust them without validating the reasons we don't blindly trust men. And then they have to show us over time that they're safe to trust. Because don't forget, this isn't like traditional trauma wounds in the sense that they're, in trauma, normally it's over and now you're looking back at it. This trauma isn't over. It's continually happening. We are likely to walk out of our homes today or tomorrow and encounter slight or overt forms of sexism or danger from men. This is continuing, and we have to heal from the past while still living in the soup and the mix of all of this. So the next step to getting to your empowerment around trauma or wounds is that you need to process your anger. So the first step is also that I mentioned before about the empathic witness is to sit with your grief, to process your grief, and to even validate that it happened. Now we're talking about processing the anger. This step is so imperative. And we'll talk more about the double bind that women are in when it comes to experiencing anger, but it is a necessary step in the healing process. So I want you to be prepared for that. Because once we process our backlog of anger, now we can learn how to use anger for its proper purpose, which is to set boundaries and to protect ourselves. It isn't meant to be used as a form to harm others or punish others. It's meant to give a person the courage and activation energy to get away from something that's unfair or harmful or to stand up to it. That's all the anger is really designed to do. It's meant to be kind of a one and done, like a snap from a dog who's getting its bone taken. And that's where I want us to land with this work. We need to process the grief and the anger and come out the other side as uncompromising, sturdy protectors of ourselves and the other women in our lives. Only then can we tap back into our true feminine softness instead of overcompensating with aggression or subservience. We kind of go both ways, right? Pendulum as always. Either we are out of alignment by becoming more like toxic masculine, where we're really aggressive and we act like men in the world, or we become subservient and we don't have any needs and we quiet all of it. We don't have any anger. We don't have any protection. We need to get off of that pendulum completely. And then we can tap into that beautiful softness and wisdom that's in us and really feel our intuition. So now I'd like to clarify who this episode is for. It's for the millions, billions of women who have been invalidated about their fears, the reason they're guarded, and their difficulty trusting men because they've gone through physical and or emotional harm by men, or they've witnessed it in other women. And by women, I mean all women, trans, cisgender, fluid, all. It's also for men, though, too, who truly want to understand our experience. And here's my big disclaimer for the men listening. If you want to learn, this is a great resource, and I want you to expand that and check out other resources. Don't put the burden of this all on the women in your lives to teach you. But if you're a man who wants to come here to argue, keep scrolling. I'm not interested. So here's what I'm hoping people will take from this episode. I want you to get a renewed trust that your experiences and intuition are valid and should be used as tools to navigate your future encounters. And I want you to have solutions of how to express yourself and expect better from the men in your life. And especially, I want you to stop sublimating your anger for the comfort of men. I want you to start expecting more. And if a man cannot tolerate your experiences, keep moving. Okay? Finally, I want to give you a trigger warning. At some point in this episode, perhaps, but definitely in the next episode, I will be discussing very real harm to women. It will include topics like rape, incest, abuse, domestic violence, murder, femicide, obviously, which can be very triggering if you've experienced this or you've been harmed by it by somebody else. But I'm also going to openly voice my opposition to the current conservative agenda and Donald Trump. So this may be very upsetting to some people, but I like to give the disclaimer that as therapists, we're typically asked to keep our political agendas out of work, but I don't see this as a political topic because it relates to the rights and safety of millions, arguably billions of people if you take into account the impact America has on world issues. So I treat it as a humanitarian issue, and I firmly believe in this quote, that the only thing needed for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing, and I will not do nothing. Which is a perfect segue back to the topic at hand. now that the disclaimers are done, because that's exactly the problem we're running into with the average man these days. Abuse, extraction, and manipulation of women, both personally and systemically, is allowed to continue simply because the majority of men still stay silent about it. That's the problem. The only thing needed for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. I heard another good quote recently that relates to this, and I'm afraid I don't have the source, so please comment if you know it so I can give them credit, but it goes like this. If men held other men accountable for misogyny the same way that they challenge women for feminism, the world would be unrecognizable. Think about that. Think about how frequently you hear men go, not all men, and wait a second, and why are you being so bitchy, and why are you so harsh, and why do you want to blame all the men? Why are you a man hater? What's wrong with you? Versus calling out other men for actually being problematic. Wouldn't it be amazing if more energy was spent on calling out misogyny than calling out feminism? So let's state the thing that most of us know right up front. In a majority of cases, the men in our lives are staying silent. And these are going to sound like innocuous things, but they matter. His friend makes an off-color joke about wishing he could just rip that woman's clothes off and do God knows what to her body. His coworker talks about what a bitch his female boss is, and she's just such a nag. His hiring team ignores female candidates for leadership, and they don't even realize they're doing it, right? The female applicants' resumes may be stronger even than the male applicants, but they're just kind of breezing over them. His brother complains about his wife still sitting on his ass while she does everything around the house, childcare, housekeeping, all that kind of stuff. And he's just doing nothing, but she's so annoying. His son belittles his girlfriend for being too sensitive about her period cramps. His friend jokes about making the difficult woman in accounting wait for the report because he'll teach her not to be so demanding. You get the point. I know every single woman listening to this has witnessed every single one of those things. And she's also witnessed a man hear it and not say anything. We say something, and then we get again called difficult if we do say something. So again, these might seem like innocuous events. They're not even the overt harassment or assaults most of us have experienced. But they set the stage for normalizing unfairness and harm to a whole group of people. When we see people doing overtly harmful things, do we think it's okay to stay silent? Because the problem is silence helps to normalize behavior because there's no threat of social consequences. But even worse than the ones who do stay silent are the many who get defensive. These men are so quick to say, not all men, like I said before. Or they expect women to give them the benefit of the doubt instead of first making sure the woman who's expressing a concern is heard and stable and cared for. I actually had that happen to me recently. You might have heard in a recent episode that I was sexually harassed in a pretty scary manner while I was on my morning walk in my neighborhood. And when I reported it on my neighborhood app, a couple of men, of course, jumped in and they literally mansplained the experience to me and what the perpetrator probably meant and essentially told me to stop being so hysterical and reading into it. And to be clear, there was absolutely nothing hysterical about my post. It was just firm and factual about the actions that happened. But these men felt it was more important to advocate for the men who scared me than to make sure my experience was validated. And here's where all these men get it wrong. Most of them are thinking, well, I'm not doing those things, so I'm not part of the problem. And here's my very firm response to that. If you say nothing, you are part of the problem. You are doing something harmful. Let's think about it this way. I'm going to go to an extreme example. If someone started showing signs of wanting to shoot up a school and you didn't report that behavior and they did it, wouldn't you feel some level of guilt, some level of responsibility for having prevented it? So when men see their friends, coworkers, or anyone behaving in misogynistic ways, it is incumbent upon them to say something because they don't know where that behavior will stop. And they need to stop normalizing it by saying nothing. This is so freaking important, guys, because here's the big deal. The group that is being marginalized, the group that is being victimized cannot be the only one speaking up because they don't have the ear of those who have power. We need the people in the privileged position to be speaking on behalf of the group that's being hurt. We do know the statistics show that most women will be harmed at the hands of a man at some point in her life. And here's the deal. Saying nothing is a form of implied agreement. So there's a great comedian I love named Daniel Sloss who does a lot of progressive conversations on this as well. A couple of quotes that he has from this excellent excerpt that I love is, I'm going to quote him here. "I knew a man for 8 years and he fucking did it." And the thought is, well, I'm not part of the problem, therefore I must be part of the solution. And that's what he had been thinking to himself, side note. But when 1 in 10 men are shit and the other 9 do nothing, they might as well not be there. This all goes back to the perspective that the oppressed class cannot make real headway without the help of the privileged class. It's a logical impossibility because the oppressed class is already set up in a system designed to undermine them. Women and all marginalized groups are forced to prove the inequalities they face to the person who is benefiting from the inequity. That's right there set up to not work, right? Why would the oppressor have an incentive to listen, let alone help you? And they can't see it from your perspective because they don't experience it. Your voice is delegitimized by systems set up to squelch your position. And my favorite example is the way that women are taught to avoid expressing anger. This is an utterly brilliant propaganda system, by the way, telling women that their anger makes them unattractive, hostile, unlovable, undesirable, nagging, bitching, whatever. We've all heard it. It keeps them from feeling and expressing the very thing that will set us free. If I can't have anger, I can't stand up for myself. Anger is a healthy emotion that is meant to give a person or an animal the courage and activation energy to stand up for themselves if they're mistreated or a boundary is violated. But if your oppressor teaches you that your primary goal in life is to attract the oppressing class, because by virtue of being in the privileged class, they have more access to resources, right? So we're taught as women, go find a man because the man has the money, the man has the power, the man has the sway. And that being angry or bitter makes you unattractive to men. You're stuck in a double bind, right? You're stuck in this horrible double bind. And your survival instincts will move you to suppress your anger and play the game just so you can stay connected to men and power through that. This is played out very overtly as it relates to white supremacy and racism as well. Just like the other tropes we have about women being angry or bitter, we have the same ones about the angry black man or the angry black woman. We know this as it relates to white supremacy, and it's just as true with misogyny. So I want to relate this back to my own experience of white fragility. I'm going to be very vulnerable here and share some stuff that makes me uncomfortable and I carry some shame around because I can sort of relate to the way that men who are pushing back want to say not all men. But also this example is to invite them to grow. If you're enjoying this episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening. It helps the show grow so that we can create even more content to help you and others build an extraordinary life. So, I was in graduate school when Trump was elected into office the first time, and I was part of a wonderful group of other counseling students that worked together to form the first ever chapter of Counselors for Social Justice at our university. I believe our impetus was mostly in response to the fears we had about the Trump administration, but I can't speak for everyone, of course. But as we worked on our mission to start finding ways to protect marginalized communities and groups, and we continued our coursework, we had some tension within the group around the topic of white supremacy because it felt like some students made it the only topic worthy of discussion in the classroom. And if we weren't constantly up in arms about it, we were just being racist. At least that's a message some of us got or perceived. And what these students were pointing out was how embedded white supremacy was into everything about the system and therefore our program too. So that's just the same way that sexism is so embedded into our current systems that it's so insidious we don't even recognize many aspects of it anymore until people call it out. And it gets kind of tiring to hear people call it out all the time. We're like, yeah, we know it's there. Great. But if it's still there, it still needs to be called out. So despite considering myself, pretty woke at this time and obviously overtly anti-racist, I was still learning a lot of things that made me feel embarrassed not to know. And there were some people who called me out in very kind ways and people who called me out in harder ways, right? So I learned the fact, for example, that like reverse racism is not a valid concept. By the way, if you didn't know this, look it up. It could be news to you too. You can't have an ism against a dominant group. You can only have prejudice. So look it up. It's actually really cool. And I struggled at points to understand why they had to be so constantly focused on this, to the point that sometimes I felt personally targeted by their comments, which I now realize was my own shame for being complicit. And if I'm being really honest, under the surface of all of this for me was a little bit of that not all white people sentiment, right? Like the not all men comment. But what I failed to understand was that by not taking real action against all the insidious ways that white supremacy infiltrated our system, I was complicit in its damage. And here's the most painful part to admit. I didn't get like super active in my anti-racism until Trump came into office, because here's the truth. I didn't see the need to get serious about racism until they started coming for my people too. Ooh, that's hard to admit, but it's true. They started coming for women. They started coming for people with disabilities. So now it was important to get involved because I saw it affecting me and my people as well. And of course, I was always aghast that they were coming for people of color or that any racism existed already. But it was getting so much more overt at that time. So it was very clear that it was time to step in on this topic, right? But the point is, I didn't need to recognize all the ways that systemic racism was still baked into our system because it didn't really hurt me directly, and it seemed really subtle to me at the time. So I say all this to reveal my own history of not fighting because it didn't affect me enough. Now, I'm not saying we all have the ability to fight every fight, and we really can't. We can't stay in that constant fighting mode. But I am saying this. With every privilege you hold over a marginalized group, you also have the responsibility of leading the revolution for that group. I'm also not talking about like white savior complex or anything like that, guys. I'm just saying we need to be the ones validating the experience of the oppressed group and naming oppression when it happens to the in-group, to the oppressor, to the privileged group. So as a white person, my job is to name when I see racism occur to another white person. That isn't leaving the oppressed forced to convince the oppressor. That is the privileged group saying, oh, we have some cleaning up to do, and I'm going to be a part of that. So when we come back to men who insist that we lead any complaint with not all men, let's get back to the quote from the beginning. A man's life will become better if he does not judge all women by the actions of the most cruel few. A woman's life will be over if she does not judge all men by the actions of the most cruel few. This is so poignant because it's true, literally. First, that a man would miss out on wonderful opportunities of love if he judges all women by the cruelty of a few who may have mishandled his heart, right? The risk is he might have his heart mishandled again. He might be hurt again emotionally. But even more salient and really pressing, because it's life and death, is most women today, and I am not being hyperbolic when I say this, they would be dead if they didn't assume the worst qualities they've seen or heard about in men and guard against them. Literally, think about this in your life. I'm 45 years old. I would not have lived this long if I or my parents or caregivers had implicitly trusted all the men I've encountered in my life. And I know you know that's true for you too. Let that sit for a moment. Think about your own life. I'm sad to say that I bet you could say this is totally true for you, and at a minimum, you would have suffered major violations to your body if you had just implicitly trusted all the men in your life. And the men in our lives know this, but they discount it. Ask them if they would leave their female child with a male babysitter that had not been thoroughly vetted. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Would they leave their female child with a female babysitter that had not been thoroughly vetted? Most cases, yes. Because we know women don't do this, men do this. We also look at the fact that we have to stop pretending that the risks that men and women take in order to connect with each other are equal. A man's fear of being laughed at or having his heart broken, honestly, it doesn't even clock in the same reality as a woman's fear of being killed. And when I post this online, oh my God, you should see the comments section where the men just get up in a tizzy, again, protecting themselves over the women who actually legitimately have been harmed. We aren't talking about my friend of a friend of a friend who got hurt. We're talking about every single woman has at least one story, okay? It is statistically proven. And I think men need to diminish our experience for a lot of reasons, but I want to talk about a few of them here. First, obviously, is that shame I mentioned in my own story around white supremacy. It's really hard to hold up that mirror and realize that by taking no action, you are part of the problem. We'd rather dig in our heels than acknowledge that we have been self-centered and at fault. Second, many of these men are still very much indoctrinated into misogyny, and they're taught to hate the feminine. So they also hate the feminine in themselves, and they feel uncomfortable being called out in these ways. And that goes into the misogyny of men must be competent in order to be worthy. So if I admit I do something wrong, I am therefore admitting I'm incompetent, and by proxy, I am not worthy. Third, that goes into the pure insecurity, right? Think about it this way. Anyone who feels secure in themselves doesn't need power over others. And I think you'll notice the men who yell the loudest really do have high narcissistic wounding, which is a core symptom of deep insecurity. Another reason is they fear losing their privilege, right? If we really shake up the system, and by the way, we don't want to invert it, we would just want equality, they're afraid they'll lose. They have an advantage right now, right? Remember that quote? Currently, it is accredited to Franklin Leonard. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression because you're used to having a leg up. Everything is easier. You don't realize how much harder it actually is until you have to play on an equal playing field. Beyond that, I really think these men fear that women will do to them what they've done to women, which is the great irony. Like, we can't flip this on its head because we already know how bad it is for you. That is the pure admission. We know how bad this is for you. We don't want it done to us. They see feminism and matriarchy as an inversion of patriarchy, but they're nothing like that. Feminine isn't about a desire to hold power over men. It's a desire to have equal consideration and power with men. And matriarchy is not about women leading men. It's actually a non-hierarchical system where the goal is to always improve the lives of the majority, always consider the majority and everyone who has less power, children, otherly abled people. We're always trying to consider what is best for the group. So yes, sometimes leadership must occur, but decision-making is shared and it optimizes the outcomes for all. Now, the final reason I think this is going on is I hope we are in the death throes of the patriarchy, and anything that is in its death throes does a lot of kicking around and screaming. It is very upset. And leaders like Donald Trump and his minions are using male fragility and, frankly, undereducated men to get a lot of indoctrination going up so that they will do their bidding and keep different classes of people at a disadvantage. This is not just women. These are people of color. These are people, otherly abled people. These are different immigration statuses. They are using men to indoctrinate them, to get them to keep us down. Now, I genuinely believe that solving the issue of sexism is one of the most important issues in the world today because it's at the heart of majority of the world's problems. Going into that conversation on matriarchy and feminism, women don't treat people this way. And I've had someone tell me that's because they haven't had power and power breeds this. Yes, it can at times, and I know that there are women who have gotten into states of power who have manipulated the system and acted like men. But I do believe the majority of the time that is because they're trying to play at a man's game. So they're playing the way a man would play. That's how they got to that position of power, is to act like more of like a toxic masculinity, right? But if we could level the playing field and have more balance in feminine and masculine power, we wouldn't need this greed. We wouldn't operate from a state of fear all the time. So ladies, I want you to hear everything I just said, and I want you to get pissed off. I want you to tap into your healthy anger and start using it to demand change. I know you heard that and you're like, oh my God, I don't want to be that woman. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be a bitch. I don't want to be a nag. I'm not talking about that. I want to clear that up. I am not talking about that. I'm talking about walking into a room and knowing what you're worth and ignoring the people who are not listening. That's a totally different energy. So in my next episode, I will be covering what you can do personally to start changing the system, because we don't have to accept this, and we can't continue to play into the system if we really want something different. We are going to have to get uncomfortable. We're going to also have to get comfortable with being disliked by the men who don't get it yet. Because remember this, the truly good men who are healed and with us won't ever dislike you for standing up for fairness. And they're the ones you really want. Okay? So let's get serious about making this change. I want you to get out there, and I want you to shine at your brightest. And I want you to remember to stop chasing and start choosing. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Resourced Podcast. My hope is that you learned at least one practical tool you can apply to your life today to move in the direction of your dreams. If you found this content helpful, be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a review, and consider subscribing to my email list, which is linked in the show notes. And remember, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. What step will you take today?